who are the players that are going to energize our teams and get past the fatigue of this season? That more this week on the couch. Always energized when I get to spend time with John Daigle. John, it's the teams that you have left that are going to survive, or the players that you feel confidence in. Who's energizing right now as we get through this long, hard slog of a season?
As someone who was just last night sifting through the waiver wire like a lot of people trying to plug in for injuries and bye weeks, the player that popped up quite often for me was Elijah Moore. And there are some caveats that go along with Moore. I get it, because unbeknownst to a lot of people box score chasing, he wasn't targeted in the first quarter. Never a good sign.
Right.
But we're also coming down to the part of the year where veterans are struggling to stay on the field. Adam Thielen, like, good luck plugging him into your lineup, as everyone knows who's been playing him the last month over this next finalization of the season. Amari Cooper also is one of those players, and that leads me to Elijah Moore, because although Amari Cooper has historically been a warrior for his career and played through injuries, albeit not leading to results, we've now seen back-to-back games with Cooper suffering a rib injury and the concussion protocol now. I would think, although Olave tended to clear himself last week, I would think Cooper misses this week. It's, first of all, an amazing spot against the Jaguars defense, who we saw what they just allowed Jake Browning, of all quarterbacks, to do in prime time. Not only that, but this rapport from Moore and Joe Flacco actually did come to fruition. It usually doesn't whenever players show up to the podium and say they love playing with that guy. And in this case of Moore and Flacco, they literally both went to the podium and they said it's a family reunion. They both emphasized how much they genuinely love the other person, not love playing. They said they love that individual. And that's what happened. Elijah Moore then, from over the last 3 quarters, a team high 29% target share and a 20-yard depth of target. And it's not like Jameson Williams getting a 20-yard depth of target, because Jameson Williams gets 1 to 3 targets, and thus we can't start him in fantasy football. He's not usable at all. But when you're getting these coin flip targets downfield and also double-digit targets, that's what we want to chase, because that gives us more outs and more opportunity to perhaps catch one of those winning coin flip situations. So assuming Cooper will be out and Joe Flacco will once again be starting for Dorian Thompson-Robinson, I think Elijah Moore is a player to actually really get excited about in the fantasy playoffs.
Yeah, it maybe finally, and it's so fascinating because when you talk about Elijah Moore and his outlook going forward, John, there's an element of luck. The luck being that Amari Cooper got hurt, right? Otherwise, Elijah Moore just stays in this unimaginative role. You mentioned Adam Thielen, or they're using him like he's Hunter Renfrow, or a player that is a short range target, very monotone usage in the offense. That's why his numbers always had the same tenor to them of usually 6 or 7 yards a catch, even sometimes when he would get a lot of targets. And then Cooper goes out, because I believe Cooper also had 5 targets early. Like you said, Moore wasn't really targeted early because it's Joe Flacco. Now, I think Dorian Thompson-Robinson is back in practice, so we'll see. Cooper didn't practice, and we'll see what. It's so funny, John, this year there's been quarterback Armageddon, so that we're going into the week sometimes not even knowing who's going to start for more than one team. And what we're starting to understand is the psychology of some of these organizations as they're, look at what the Browns have done. It's Dorian Thompson-Robinson. No, he's not ready. It's PJ Walker. No, he's too inconsistent, and Thompson-Robinson is closer now, so let's go with him. Well, now he's hurt. We're not going back to PJ Walker. Let's go with Joe Flacco. He's been onboarding for a week or two. Now, what do they do with this fork in the road? Because it was clear that Flacco brought a dimension to downfield passing to the offense that Thompson-Robinson just wasn't.
I would argue that Deshaun Watson didn't even bring.
Sure, for that matter. And now, how much of that is, certainly against the Steelers, they had Thompson-Robinson just getting the ball out quickly. Just get the ball out of your hands quickly. So we're watching this, and like you said, we could see by the end of the season, Elijah Moore as an important player for fantasy teams, an important player in this offense, and one that, after all, this winding, twisting road of the Browns offense, when they made that trade with the Jets. And it's funny that Joe Flacco ends up in the story. Like you said, there's a connection here. There's a past with these guys. Ends up, and how much would the Jets like to have Joe Flacco right now? for that matter. How long is the pole? Is it shorter or longer than 10 feet when you're setting your lineup? Because we're past the bye week gauntlet, Washington, Arizona this week, and then we're going to have all 32 teams available. So it's going to make lineup choices a little more difficult. How long is the pole that you need to push Garrett Wilson or Breece Hall into your lineup?
Breece Hall is a really tough one. I had, we all go out with our friends, and then my friends may bounce off trade questions to me. And it's one I still keep thinking about because a few weeks back, one of my friends asked me, does he keep Breece Hall or Josh Jacobs the rest of the season? And it was that time where before their bye, Josh Jacobs had a 3.5% target share, literally wasn't using the passing game under Antonio Pierce from Aiden O'Connell whatsoever. So the magic had run out. And then we all saw what happened to the Raiders. Like, he did spike that big 60-yard touchdown run, but after their first two drives against the Chiefs, the Raiders were outscored 31-3. It was the exact Raiders we thought they were the entire time. But for Breece Hall, the process was right in being used in the passing game more and thinking this team was going to be behind a ton. But now we've seen that Breece Hall, just in terms of yards after contact per attempt, explosive runs, the magic is completely gone. There is nothing here in this offense. And we've done this dance with Garrett Wilson too before. Garrett Wilson and Zach Wilson starts from weeks 2 through 11 had the third highest target share of any player in the league. But he was wide receiver 32 in points per game because he had to score a touchdown just to reach his ceiling. And that ceiling with a touchdown even was a wide receiver 2. It was like a fringe top 20 finish because these targets, which has been the theme of 2023 football, is understanding how you get your targets and where and what they are doing. And these targets from Zach Wilson obviously have been terrible. So although it's a good spot on paper against the Texans defense that has been pretty bad, honestly, to opposing quarterbacks in passing games over the last month of the season, for Garrett Wilson, it's the same thing. It's a wide receiver 3 and cross your fingers for a touchdown.
Yeah. It's funny too how this season the deterioration. Boy, I'm going to project a lot. There are probably people. I'm loving fantasy football. This season has been great, and it's great to be us. It's great to get to do what we do, and it's great to be part of our communities. But the actual process of playing fantasy football this year has been so discouraging, and
it's been tough.
And the thing is, more and more, the cases aren't adhering to anything that makes sense across cases, right? Because you have Garrett Wilson and you have Jamar Chase. I mean, it's not apples to apples completely. Jake Browning has gotten to be an incubator for a little while in this offense. Maybe Jamar Chase, you can look at draft capital and the track records. It's hard to say what would Garrett Wilson have done if he had been drafted onto Joe Burrow's team. Statistically, it might have been the same as Jamar Chase, right? So it's hard. They're both outstanding young players at their position that are going to be among the best at their position for a long time. And, one loses their starting quarterback, and because Jamar Chase against the Steelers, if it wasn't for a deflected ball, would have had like 3 for 50. We said, well, we're on the Garrett Wilson track. And then, granted, he did catch something like 10 for 75, but that 11th on Monday night was a pretty big deal. So even that, and you look at someone like Jake Browning, what's wild, John, is that there have been so many quarterback injuries and there's so much variance in the quality of offenses and backup quarterbacks that now you're looking at Aiden O'Connell and Jake Browning. You're not in the basement of quarterback quality. You're actually, hey, at least you have Jake Browning. At least you have Aiden O'Connell. If you have Devontae Adams, who knows by the time we get to the fantasy playoffs, some of the quarterbacks are going to be starting, right?
And the test really for these offenses has been, can your backup quarterback, at least for our fantasy purposes, deliver in great matchups? And that was something that, for instance, Jordan Love wasn't even doing in the first couple months of the season. But now the last month, the schedule has opened up greatly. And I think he has improved just operating from a pocket as well. Although he has some wild throws. He's a lot of fun to watch because it seems a lot of the time like that ball shouldn't be thrown or that ball shouldn't be completed. And then all of a sudden, it just is winged downfield to Jaden Reed, who's like fighting off his man and coming up with it. The Packers, who also have quite literally the youngest receiving core in the league, so it would make sense if it took them 2 months all to just figure it out anyhow. But Jordan Love was once we saw what he did against the Chargers, we thought, okay, we can definitely start you against the Lions on Thanksgiving. And then now this last month has helped him improve, even in a much tougher spot against the Chiefs, although it was at home. Then we saw how well he did on Sunday Night Football. And Jake Browning was another guy where I had major question marks about. And the schedule, at least the last 2 weeks, against a Steelers defense who does have TJ Watt, but they're still allowing a top 7 rate of 15-yard completions through the air. They've been a much more leaky defense than people think. And, of course, the Jaguars, Jake Browning got there. And we're at least seeing that Jamar Chase is not going to go the same route as Garrett Wilson, because now these last 2 games, in those spots we need backups to step up in, Jamar Chase has a 27.7% target share, and he's been the wide receiver 13 in points per game. And it's another soft spot this upcoming week against the Colts, who push the pace, top 10 in plays per game now with Gardner Minshew under center. So we love the spot for both Jake Browning and Jamar Chase now, because we didn't lose any amount of faith. I can't say that, though, for someone like, we already talked about Garrett Wilson, but Jordan Addison, for example. Jordan Addison was struggling to get there without Justin Jefferson already. So now what happens when you have Justin Jefferson? I don't think this becomes a situation where Josh Dobbs is capable of carrying 2 wide receivers, because T.J. Hawkinson's always going to get his. Whenever Dobbs was starting for the Cardinals through week 8, they were second in the league in rate of targets to their tight ends. That's just the way Josh Dobbs operates. And now in this last month with the Vikings are leading the league in rate of target to tight ends, because, again, that's where Josh Dobbs prefers to throw. And so we don't think Hawkinson, just by the way Dobbs plays, is going anywhere. But Jordan Addison now was a fringe wide receiver 3, nearly a wide receiver 4, which he did finish in his last 2 starts with Dobbs without Jefferson. So I'm worried. I consider Addison because, as you know, we're in the time of the year where we're all jostling our playoff rosters, and there are these guys who have name value that no one wants to cut, but you can. Jerry Jeudy's one. Terry McLaurin. I don't know if anyone's seen the Commanders' playoff schedule. Like Terry McLaurin, I know we want to keep. It's rough out there. So I think Terry McLaurin can be cut as well. I consider Jordan Addison in that range too. I know you don't want to, but again, I don't know how he fights for fantasy relevancy when he barely could without Jefferson.
Yeah, I think Addison is one of those players that you have a sense of, okay, well, now you need to see what he does. Well, let me start here, John. In 1 quarterback leagues, I think in 2 quarterback superflex leagues, you have a little more risk tolerance at quarterback 2 superflex. But Josh Dobbs has been named the starter for week 14 against Las Vegas. But are you reluctant to recommend him? Like if someone said, I've got Gardner Minshew or Matthew Stafford, or, Stafford doesn't have a great matchup, Minshew, limited ceiling. I have a lower ceiling quarterback, but not one that we know the team was just evaluating. Like, are you worried about Joshua Dobbs not making it through the game against Las Vegas if he starts to throw picks like he did before the bye?
It is certainly scary. I think Gardner Minshew and Joe Flacco even have better matchups personally. If I were to guarantee Dobbs' leash, I would take the rushing floor over Joe Flacco, but I can't guarantee that. So especially if Nick Mullins is going to be activated this game, then they have at least somewhere else to go to that they're confident in. So I can't do it personally, but I do get it if someone's that desperate. I would love, for instance, to go to Stafford. But, man, not only are the weather conditions projected to be bad for Rams-Ravens, Stafford's been an entirely different quarterback when he's been under pressure. And that wasn't a spot we worried about the last 2 games against the Cardinals, and even last week against the Browns, since they're dealing with so many injuries. Jordan Elliott, Myles Garrett banged up, Denzel Ward. The Browns are not the same defense they were previously. So I was somewhat confident in Stafford as a QB2 last week. But against the Ravens, no chance in hell, especially coming off of a bye. So I do want to go to those other desperate options instead.
Yeah, maybe Baker Mayfield against Atlanta, something like that. But
also because of the way the landscape is at quarterback right now, I initially in the waiver column had Matthew Stafford as a drop for this week. But now, given that he plays the Commanders next week, I actually think we should just hold him from our opponents, because someone in the playoffs is probably going to drop someone for Matthew Stafford who will be a low-end QB1 next week, even without buys, because the Commanders have been so bad and good for fantasy.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, we're not going to start any not going to start Zach Wilson against them, maybe in 2-quarterback
No.
super flex. I mean, that's the thing. Hey, 2-quarterback super flex leagues, there's not even 24 quarterbacks.
No.
But you're right. You bring up Garrett Wilson, just going back to that real quickly. The problem is he hasn't done anything to give you that fear of missing out, of leaving him on your bench. It's what's happening with Adam Thielen right now. And then you even get into drops, and I'll nod to Paul Charchian, who coined sabotage drop. Adam Thielen's a great sabotage drop right now, because there are certain players. I guess the best way I would put it, John, is once we have a trend that is 2 or 3 weeks of data, not just a 1 week without context, then you need a week before you even consider them. And then you probably really need 2 weeks before you truly trust them. And we're at the point in the season where to give a player 2 weeks, to give an offense 2 weeks, to see what's going to happen with Calvin Ridley. I think it's rational. I'm not saying I would do it. I'm not saying I would advise somebody to do it. But we may look back on folks that dropped Calvin Ridley this week as very savvy players. Now, part of that is the Trevor Lawrence timeline. The Jags are trying to say he's not ruled out yet. But come on. I mean, really. But I mean, the point being that because we don't have time to wait around, then if you're saying, well, I'm not sure if I can use this player right now, that's a sign that it might be best to just move on and get more injury upside backup running backs or something like that. And that leads to another thing that's been on my mind a lot this week, John. It's kind of like embracing the chaos, right? More than looking at your lineup, more than looking at the players that have gotten you this far and that you're likely to start, you really need to be concentrating this week on who's on your bench. And how do you feel about those players? Mm-hmm. We don't spend as much time thinking about that, because I would imagine a lot of people out there, especially last week with 6 teams on bye, all of a sudden found the quality of their bench was a lot more important than they thought when they were making these waiver wire decisions or picking these players up or deciding to not drop them. And I think because of some of the things you pointed out, veterans are wearing down, right? We have teams as they fall. Now, granted, boy, it's hard to fall out of the playoff race right now. More teams are getting back in the playoff race than falling out of it. That's the kind of season it's been.
I don't think people realize the Giants are only 2 games out of the playoffs, as crazy as that sounds. That's how wide open it is this year.
The Jake Browning Bengals should be still considering themselves. I mean, the list of teams, we could look right now, like Washington, Arizona, they're on bye. The Jets are definitely not making the playoffs. New England, they're not making the playoffs. Tennessee, they're out of it. Vegas, probably out of it. The Chargers, that's one of the teams that are definitely out of it. You mentioned the Giants, Chicago, Carolina.
The Joe Flacco Browns are still in it. Like Joe Flacco's actually trying to lead a team to the playoffs. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, so like 2/3 of the league or a little bit more, it's still very much in playoff contention. So it's going to be interesting to see how that sorts itself out. And then, as you're also mentioning too, matchups are changing. What was a tough matchup, just you take you weaken Myles Garrett and you take Denzel Ward out of the lineup and Elliott, and then all of a sudden the Browns are not one that we fear, but these things can switch back too. So watching for these factors. So it's so unstable that I feel like making that last little move at the end of your bench sometimes, like, okay, Jerick McKinnon's hurt, I'm not holding on to him, I'm going to pick up Dearness Johnson or something like that. Those are going to be the kind of moves that once we get to week 16, week 17 in the fantasy playoffs and the championship, that make a difference.
Which is why
go ahead.
Because I do so many shows throughout the week for different formats, just because I wear many hats, and only because I love wearing many hats. I think it helps all of my process. Like my betting show appearances helps me with redraft start sits. My redraft matchup analysis helps me with DFS. Just in game theory helps me with all of it. So that's why I enjoy doing it. And I don't use, I'm aware, but some people may say, and no one does, I would think everyone that listens to me, trust me, that's why they're listening. But I don't use a lot of, like, people show up and use EPA per play, advanced metrics like that. I'm aware of them, but I don't like using that, pass rate over expectation, etc., because I like adding context for the week-to-week matchups. I like to make sure, as you mentioned, we just talked about the Browns defense, for example. I like to make sure I'm ahead of that spot, because if you look at the advanced metrics, obviously the Browns defense pops everywhere. But if I'm also aware of their current injury situations for that week, I can tell you they're not the same defense whatsoever. Thus, that's why I'm a little more confident in starting either Cooper Kupp or Puka Nacua, both who got there last week. So I always just like to add context every single week, and it's a lot of work, but I like to make sure I break it down every week to ensure that I'm just not taking everything from the past. That's not matchup analysis whatsoever, in my opinion.
Yeah, you're right. Well, you're throwing a bunch of disparate data into one bucket and averaging it and making and saying that's predictive. And there's so much noise in that data because it's data that comes from offenses that maybe aren't the same as the offense that's going to take the field against defenses that are different than the defense that they're going to take the field against. And I think you're right that, I mean, you should definitely be aware of advanced metrics. And it's always good to see. I always like to say that those advanced metrics analytics, I always love to say back in the day, they're good for asking questions, but not answering questions. They're good for finding things, especially if you're looking through them, you're like, huh, that surprises me. Then you want to go back and investigate and say, well, why or how did we get there? Now, if you lower the window and say, let's just look at these metrics, say over the last 3 to 4 weeks, not the entire season. And then additionally, you add the context of, well, and this is where Football Outsiders innovated this, I think, this idea of saying what matters is not how a unit performed, but it's how they perform compared to all the other peers. You know, I mean, you might have had a bad day against this defense, but your bad day at least mustered up 2 offensive touchdowns. That's, if it's, you know, the 2000 Ravens or something like that, that's actually a good day, right? We can say it's not the result in an absolute sense, it's the result relative compared to everybody else. And you see this with some good scatter plot charts and things like that. But you're right that especially when you get drilled down to the DFS and betting level and the micro, then it becomes important for this context. I guess on that note, give me an idea of the kind of thing, because I think this happens for me across articles, but I'm not nearly covering as many areas as you are, John, where you'll be doing something like you said, DFS will make you better at this. Knowing all the betting angles helps you better with start sit questions. What's a moment, like an aha moment that you've had where while you're preparing for one area, an insight strikes you that you then carry over to something else, and you make a mental note like, I'm going to make sure this is reflected across my work on all these levels. Or it can even just be like something you are looking at that you would only be looking at because you're doing DFS or because you're doing betting that isn't considered a fantasy stat, but has a lot of fantasy value.
I can tell you one that I've been stressing all of last week and this week. And the reason why I don't get tired of DFS, playing poker, etc., it's because every hand, every week, every game is an entirely different adventure. And our job is to then, this is also why, like, whenever my time comes, because it comes for us all, that we move to the burbs and hang out with our adult friends, whenever my time comes for that, I want to feature like it's too hard for adults to meet every week. I get it, but I want to have like a monthly board game night because I love board games. I just love games. I love trying to figure out how to win the game, and not even in a competitive sense, just in my own. It's why I run a lot, because I'm just trying to just see how far I can go and challenge myself. I don't really actually care about the competition to others. And so what I've noticed then, like going through and looking at all the defenses, all the quarterbacks, I've realized that everyone is stressing, and everyone's even asking, whether it's the chat every week. I get it. This is the time of year where everyone asks which defenses to stash for the fantasy playoffs. But I would argue that the slate has changed this year. 2023 football has allowed us to not only not stash defenses and only go one, because there is literally someone every single week we can target with defenses on the waiver wire. Even like the Commanders, no one's trying to pick up the Commanders, but you even said it earlier, Sig, we're also not playing Zach Wilson against the Commanders. So what does that do? We don't need to be stashing 2 defenses when the Commanders are going to be available next week. We'll just pick them up off the waiver wire for free and play them as a top 12 option against Zach Wilson. So the quarterbacks this year, the backups, the injuries, it has happened in such a mass volume, and they are so poor that it is easy to find any defense you want off waiver wire. This week, everyone I think has already been targeting the Texans, but you can go beyond that and go to the Patriots. You can go to the Jaguars if you wish against Joe Flacco. You can kind of do whatever you want, honestly. Not only that, But all of the other injuries outside of quarterbacks has now created a much more pressing need for flex options for everyone. And so rather than stashing this defense, I would tell you to stash a contingency wide receiver or running back. And that's much more important. I even luck box because last week with Jerick McKinnon out, it became clear that Isaiah Pacheco was handling every single touch. But the situations I look at are the backup running backs who have no competition. And I saw that Pacheco had no one touching the ball behind him, and thus Clyde Edwards-Helaire was the only running back available without McKinnon. So I said, okay, I'm just going to pick up Clyde Edwards-Helaire and stash him just in case if McKinnon is still out. And look at Pacheco now, who has a shoulder contusion and missed practice on Wednesday. We don't know his status in what's going to be the highest scoring game of the week, probably between the Bills and Chiefs. At least we think could be one of them. So I think prioritizing those guys is much more important than stashing two defenses this year, because the rules have changed for this year since defenses are widely available and can easily pop against backups. That also beyond CEH has shown itself in this week, especially. Derrick Henry's going to play on Monday night, but we didn't think so for 48 hours there. So anyone who took that notion for Tajay Spears thought they got there. We don't know about DeAndre Swift's status just yet after he had that big hit in the fourth quarter. So Kenneth Gainwell, who handled 81% of backfield touches in week one, could get there. Both Zach Charbonnet and Kenneth Walker are injured, so maybe DJ Dallas gets there. Ezekiel Elliott is obviously going to get there because Ramondre Stevenson is now droppable for Elliott because we don't think Stevenson's going to come back at all to a team playing for the number one overall pick. So it's just like this year, trying to fill all these spots, you need to prioritize those backup players who can walk into a starting role and every touch role rather than two defenses.
Yeah, I think that's fair. The only exceptions I would say are San Francisco is really surging right now. Dallas, Deron Bland. But of one that wasn't one people were drafting, Indianapolis. I think Indianapolis by most. And now, granted, you don't need to carry a backup. But I mean, I agree with you that you should only carry one defense. But I think there are a few defenses that you would set or forget, but only a few. And you're absolutely right. I do rent a defense, I think was the term. I don't even remember when I started to do it, John, like 2009, 2010. It's like, why do you draft and play a defense every week? Just pick someone based on matchups every week. And
I also, I hate to tell you, but you just mentioned it. I dropped the Dallas Cowboys defense this week. Because
well, that's fair.
It comes to the time where, again, the name value does not matter. I do not care.
Yeah.
We are so far removed from ADP. If that's still baked in your process, you're just doing it wrong. Like, we do not care where we drafted you. And so now you see the Cowboys play the Eagles, Bills, Dolphins, and Lions through the fantasy playoffs. I'm not interested. I'm just not interested. So I'm going to pick up the better options against backup quarterbacks.
Yeah, that's fair. Well, I'll make this caveat. Sure. I would say that if you're in a league that has big penalties and big additions for yards and points allowed,
completely fair. Yep.
Dallas is probably potentially landmine. But if you're just looking for big plays, then Dallas, even in those matchups, that's fun. That's going to be really fun. Maybe that's how Dallas pulls the sword from the stone, along with Mike McCarthy having to go have emergency surgery, speedy recovery to him this week, is because, it's funny watching the NFC bracket unfold. And we know Dallas and Miami are kind of mirrors of each other. It's like there's absolutely nothing that either one of those teams can do in the regular season to make us think they're going to actually perform in the postseason. But playing that it's the same thing I've said about Buffalo. Yes, Buffalo has no margin of error right now, but isn't that how they can maybe finally find the internal belief in self that they've lacked since that Kansas City game, the 13 seconds, that it seems like their confidence has been a little shaken? Well, if they can just win these games and get into the playoffs, then they won't fear anything in the playoffs. They'll be ready to take it on.
And at least the Bills have done that. Like we're so far removed from it. People probably don't remember, but they dunked on the Dolphins. That was Josh Allen's not only the best game of this year, but arguably the best game of his career. They looked amazing against Miami. And that's kind of been the issue with the Dolphins and the Cowboys, because yes, you can only play who's put in front of you. And yes, they have stepped up to the plate and beaten down their opponents, but they still literally haven't beaten anyone. Anytime they've been asked, the Cowboys were asked to beat the Niners and the Eagles because that's what's on their schedule so far. They lost to both teams. The 49ers just road graded them. And then the Eagles, it came down to that red zone drive where they went to Jalen Tolbert on the last play rather than CeeDee Lamb. So that failed. And the Dolphins now, Eagles, Bills, like they've had their chances, Chiefs, and they just didn't get there at all. So we're crossing our fingers. They're a lot of fun for fantasy. When we get to the playoffs, can you actually beat a real opponent? It really seems like we're just headed for another Eagles 49ers clash, which I'm okay with. That's fine.
Yeah. With the Detroit saying, hey, maybe, probably not yet.
Gosh,
but
Detroit's defense is going to be really fun for the fantasy playoffs because they look great against the Saints, but the Saints are not an offense we ever expect to step up anyways. But anytime the Lions have been asked to stop this quarterback, they absolutely have not been able to. This goes back to week 2 against Geno Smith, who went over 320 and multiple touchdowns. Justin Herbert had 330 and 4. Lamar Jackson went over 300 with multiple touchdowns. We saw what Jordan Love did, the best game of his career in Thanksgiving. The Lions are a disaster of a secondary, which is great because that means their fantasy pieces, especially indoors. This is their last indoor game of the season for the fantasy playoffs. So we think they're going to get there every single week. And all of a sudden now, too, that week 17 game indoors against Dallas, since we have seen over the last month now, Dallas's defense, while having amazing playmakers, they are the analogy of Deron Bland in that they are opportunists. They're not shutdown players. And so they allow big plays, but still can make turnovers happen. That's amazing for fantasy because who's stopping who between the Lions and Cowboys in week 17? Probably no one. So I've been also saying that the Cowboys are definitely the key to 2023 fantasy football. Dak, CeeDee Lamb, Brandon Cooks, even Tony Pollard, who the touchdown regression, the explosiveness is still out there, but the touchdown regression that should have been happening prior is now happening in this second half of the season. Those are the keys, honestly, to winning your championship because they're all Jake Ferguson too. They're all going nuts.
Yeah, well, what's wild about the Cowboys and why you're right that they may be the key is that these massive offensive games they've been having since the bye are often in like 2.5 quarters, really, of being competitive. So what's going to happen when they're facing some offenses like Miami, like
Buffalo,
Detroit, Buffalo,
Philadelphia? It's on.
Right. It was 28. I think the first matchup was 28-23. It is on. And they're the kind of games that we could get into silly territory. And it's just a question of how much do you have of these players? And it's fun. Maybe the Cowboys actually can parlay how much talent they have into playoff success. And if you spelled out the words in that Lions defense rant, it said start Justin Fields this week, basically, because what does he have? 3 straight 100-yard rushing games against them? Or a quarterback has 3 straight 100-yard rushing games against the Lions. So that's all you need to play him if you're wondering about Justin Fields. Oh, man. You were mentioning the board games, too. We could go off the rails early. It's board games are so much fun. I don't know how much you I'm just going to totally do a quick tangent before I forget this. Sure. But Paul Charchian, obviously, been around these fantasy football parts for a long time, doing a lot of great stuff. And you see the game player in his mind. I'm going to get him back on before the end of the season with the guillotine leagues, and how that's one of his hallmarks in the fantasy football space. But also, he's turned me on to some other board games. There are cooperative board games. There's got to be a way. Like there's board games where everybody wins or everybody loses. Maybe there's some way to do that with fantasy football. Maybe there's some way to turn fantasy football. There's a puzzle in fantasy football where instead of 12 people drafting against each other, everybody collaborates to try to like solve a puzzle or beat some ideal, like building it week over week. I don't know. But I find that's fascinating. Like you said, playing games is great, but we're so used to competitive games. There's also a lot of fun in cooperative games. And that just occurred to me. But
everyone's trying to sort through how to keep their league mates involved all year long, whether it be adding different games. Like I know people are now doing both head-to-head matchups and round robin for points every week. That way, at least there's more money sprinkled. We do, like my own home leagues, we do weekly high scores as well. That way you're always competing for something. And we do a consolation bracket for additional prize pool. That way, even when you're out, you're still helping build the pot in free agency because we have a blind bidding system. And you're still competing, although you're in the consolation bracket. So we try to keep everyone involved. all year long. And I think that's what other leagues are doing. But getting to the one ultimate goal where you're all trying to win the same thing, that's interesting. I haven't thought about that.
I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure how to put it together. I'm not sure. I like to do this. I imagine a lot more people are actually listening than are, but I love you all, each and every one of you that can hear the sound of my voice right now. That if I just put something out there, the combined brain power of everybody out there, like something will come back, like a message in a bottle. That's the ocean of our podcast listeners, of the people who like to join us on YouTube. Wow. Let me ask you this. Now, this week, you're going to play Patrick Mahomes. You're going to play Patrick Mahomes because I don't know if Kansas City and Buffalo has the highest over-under. It should have the highest over-under. It certainly is the matchup that has, especially if Detroit-Chicago is in Detroit, maybe Philadelphia-Dallas, I guess, is the other one that could give it a run for its money. But what about the other matchups coming up for Patrick Mahomes? And I say this because numbers don't lie. Bob Harris, all of our wonderful uncle, likes to say, divorce the name from the numbers, right? And if you look at Patrick Mahomes' numbers right now, John, there's not even an argument to start him, really. Over the last 6 weeks, Jake Browning over the last 3 weeks has a higher scoring average than Mahomes has had over the last 6. Baker Mayfield, I think, has outscored him over the last 6. I mean, nobody's. Now, there's some players in there that have only played 1 week or 3 weeks, but when I sorted by points per game since week 8, Mahomes is the 24th ranked quarterback. So maybe is it better to say, because this is that time of year, right? And I like to say that's what can you live with? What can you live with? You can live with losing because you played Patrick Mahomes. Can you live with losing because you didn't play Patrick Mahomes? But is that valid at this point? Are we just in denial about what Patrick Mahomes is for fantasy football in 2024, 2023?
I'd be open to benching Mahomes in other matchups where you have an actual viable option behind him, but not in this matchup. Perhaps in the future, because it's as you said, last 5 games, last 6 weeks since they had that bye, Mahomes' highest finish is QB9 on the week, and now he's tied with Lamar Jackson and Jordan Love for the QB8 in fantasy points per game. And that's not even Lamar Jackson's fault. It's just that the Ravens defense is so good. They've been beating down their opponents and they just take the passing game out of it altogether, which is why Gus Edwards continues just to fall into the goal line. Although I think given the usage we saw before their bye, it's going to be Keaton Mitchell time this last month of the season. I'm excited. I'm very excited to see it. But that's what's happening. So in some matchups, sure. We don't often chase receiver drops, but there's a lot going on with this Chiefs offense, including their receivers leading the league in drops, throwing Rashee Rice into a position he's never been into his entire career, and being asked to lead like all their wide receivers who still run some kind of rotation. And that includes like their slot receivers who can't even run the full route tree, like Kadarius Toney, Sky Moore. These guys are just being asked to do too much, honestly. It does seem like their lack of talent is finally coming back to bite them, and that's worrisome. But we think this game scores so many points that it's not the environment I necessarily want to get off of. It's a lot like Gabriel Davis, how he makes a lot of sense in best ball because we don't have to pick and start sets. But obviously, whenever they play matchups we think go off, like the Eagles, for example, we put Davis into every lineup. So I think it's one of those games where we put Davis in, we put Patrick Mahomes in, we just chase the overall environment, given that the Bills' issues and why they continue losing hasn't been their offense. It's been turnovers and a lot of just honestly being unlucky, but they're still top 5 in points and yards per drive. Their offense is still moving the ball with ease, and we think they can do that in this spot.
Yeah, I think so. This spot. And maybe, they got the Raiders left, I think. And that was certainly a game where their offense got right. The Bengals, one time the Bengals, not that long ago, were for opposing passing games, a limiting factor. Got the Chiefs against the Patriots next week. But I mean, guys like, in these sentences would have sounded incoherent back in September, right, John? You're probably starting CJ Stroud over Patrick Mahomes, like CJ Stroud against Tennessee, right? Probably like versus Patrick Mahomes against New England. Justin Fields and Kyler Murray are going to be really interesting because Joshua Dobbs, if Joshua Dobbs taught us anything, it is just how easy it is for a running quarterback to be elite in fantasy football. They don't have to be effective passers. That's what I mean. Joshua Dobbs is a really fascinating player at a fork in the road for his value, where if he goes out against Vegas and has a pretty solid game and they win and they're back on track to get in the playoffs and he's restored faith, he could be one of the most valuable fantasy quarterbacks in the fantasy playoffs because we haven't even seen what he can do with Justin Jefferson. But if he goes out and stubs his toe, then we're going to maybe see Nick Mullins. And we know Nick Mullins from the San Francisco period that he will just go out and be an extension of the coach. He'll go out and run the play the way it's supposed to be run and probably be a little more reliable for Kevin O'Connell than Joshua Dobbs. So that is absolutely a big fork in the road. And the running quarterbacks, Patrick Mahomes also not really adding too much as a runner either.
No.
So
I'm excited for the Ravens. He's running the ball more because he's trying to just extend the play, but it's not resulting in fantasy points. Right.
You mentioned Lamar Jackson, and I'm a Lamar Jackson apologist. I've been a Lamar Jackson apologist since the Steelers passed on him, many other teams. And I want to say that the reason his fantasy production has been depressed is because of the game scripts. And I think it's a question of whether teams, I mean, San Francisco will be able to, but that's the problem though. Then you're facing the San Francisco defense. You do have the game against the Dolphins, and we certainly saw what that produced last year. And then the Jags, and that was looking good. Yeah, against Trevor Lawrence and the Jags offense. And now that's not necessarily looking so good. So Lamar Jackson, maybe the game against the Dolphins, but the Dolphins defense, even Vic Fangio, you got Jalen Ramsey. Now they don't have Jalen Phillips. Gain one Jalen, lose one Jalen, something like that. Even Steven. So it's going to be interesting because we're to the point now, John, where we're answering these questions on the fly. We don't get to gather more data. This is it. This is going to be the ones that count. And I agree with you about some of the ways to fit this data that makes sense. But then I won't be surprised if Lamar Jackson teams don't win fantasy championships this year because Keaton Mitchell and Gus Edwards and the defense. We'll see. But that being said, go ahead.
I do agree with that. It's funny though, because I think the pieces will win fantasy championships. Like Zay Flowers now in both of his games without Mark Andrews this year has led the team in target share. And he's finished as at least a top 24 wide receiver in both of those games. He's averaged 13.5 fantasy points in those two starts, including that Chargers game we saw where he had both a receiving and rushing touchdown. So, or at least a rushing touchdown. So yeah, I think Zay Flowers gets there. We already talked about Keaton Mitchell getting a stranglehold of the backfield touches in the game before the bye against the Chargers as well. Isaiah Likely, given the landscape of tight end, they threw him into an every down role, and he had a 20% target share and led the Ravens in receiving against the Chargers. So I think the pieces will actually help people win. But I do actually agree that just given the landscape, I don't know if Lamar Jackson helps out much because the Ravens defense is just putting boots to throats to everyone they play.
Yeah, it's really setting up for the Ravens to exercise all the disappointment in the playoffs of the Lamar Jackson era this year with the Kansas City weekend, with Cincinnati probably not in the picture, with Buffalo weekend. Jacksonville now has certainly hit a bump in the road. This is your window. And I can tell, here's my flowery story about why the Ravens, including those pieces. We've already seen the flashes. Like you said, Zay Flowers is doing it, going into the bye, scoring as a runner and a receiver, and not a rookie. We've heard this from the beginning. He's wise beyond his years. Isaiah Likely, love it. And the nice thing here, what's the key? The bye week, right? Remember, this Todd Monken offense is a new offense. Didn't really start to see it take shape until the game against Seattle and the game against Detroit. Those were the games. What is it about Lamar Jackson NFC opponents? What is it, like an 18-1 record or something ridiculous like that? And they're at home again. So maybe this game against the Rams is the game when we really see this offense spread its wings. Because isn't that what got us so excited to take Ravens in our fantasy draft was, well, what can this offense do without Greg Roman with an actual competent game plan that leverages Lamar Jackson's considerable passing ability in the pocket, and they've got some guys for him now. Odell Beckham, he had a shoulder injury, but you saw that actual extra burst to separate deep. Whoa, now you're adding that. Isaiah Likely is a really good receiver. Even Rashad Bateman, he hurt himself in practice, but he was starting to round back into form. And you add in the speed of Keaton Mitchell. This can be a really, really fun offense.
Absolutely.
And this can be a really, really fun year for them. we were starting to talk about Chicago before the show, and my brain, I guess it's because it's week 14. I guess, well, let me check in with you on that because we are on the couch, so it's kind of in between. How are you feeling? Because I keep saying, fatigue and the grind of the season and things like that. And certainly I feel like a lot of what our job has been this year, John, is helping people cope with difficulty, cope with change and a moving target. How's your gas tank at this point every week and having, like you said, to put on all these different hats? How's your energy level right now?
It comes and goes in waves throughout the week. I think probably like a few weeks ago, I was losing a lot of energy, but now this week I am back in spirits, but also the holidays, although our
Uh-huh.
schedule is very hard. Everyone's schedules are hard to navigate around the
Yeah.
holidays. There's a lot to do before you close those emails and business hours. Our schedule around football is very complicated. And so to fit in everything, I had, like, for instance, I had 3 Friendsgivings the past 10 days. And being Texan, I'm stereotyped into cooking the meat for all these Friendsgivings. So
Uh-huh.
everything came out great. The turkey, the skirt steak for Taco Bar Friendsgiving, and the
Mhm.
Cornish hens for just a smaller one all came out wonderful. But it's just odd because not only trying to fit in work with all that, it's also trying to be grateful with all that as well.
Mhm.
Since it's an emotional time of the year, whether it be for getting darker and colder everywhere, seeing friends and family. It was my birthday yesterday, and I don't
Oh,
say that.
wow.
Yeah, I don't say that for belated happy birthday from everyone in the chat. I just say that because it wraps into everything. And so after like going out for drinks with friends, I then stopped at a bar on my own, just to just sit down and be present for a moment and just like
Mhm.
appreciate what's all happened in the past year. And then of course, because it's that time of the year where you're also everything's kind of sinking in all at once. Yeah, just messaging friends and also thanking them. Like I think I texted Rich Rebar, Jay Zacharyson, among others, and just told them I love them because it's just that time of the year. So you
Yeah.
combine all that with the football and all the injuries, and it's just a lot to take in. So whatever you got to do to keep the energy up, sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's good. I think you hit on some good points there about people reaching out to the people in your life, telling
Yeah.
people how you feel. I know some people probably saw that the mayor of football guys, our spiritual leader, Joe Bryant, more than just spiritual leader, he just lost his father.
Mhm.
Who, if football guys has touched you in any way, if Joe Bryant, and if football guys has touched you in some way, then Joe Bryant has touched you, and if he has, then his father has, because he was a great role model. And one of the things he said was that you like tell people how you feel. Don't assume that people know how you feel. Don't assume,
Mhm.
and take the time to really tell people how you feel, because you they might not know, and unless you're explicit. And I think that that's always a good thing to do. So this is great. So you're saying that you're leaning into the Texas stereotype, and you're the meat purveyor. I think there actually was a business in Austin called the Texas Meat Purveyors or something like that. You're the meat purveyor. What's the key? What's your just real quick wisdom to folks? Skirt steak is a good one. What's for taco Friendsgiving? What's the key? Because the best thing about beef in Tex-Mex is you're taking cuts of beef that aren't necessarily the most expensive, but you can make them really delicious if you know what you're doing.
Skirt steak, I think everything comes down to marinade. Let's start there.
Okay.
So
Okay.
you have to, or a brine. So you have to look all that up first. But for the skirt steak, I did orange juice, apple cider vinegar, lime juice, soy sauce, uh, teriyaki, and garlic, I believe it was.
Oh yeah.
And then you let it soak in, depending on how
Hmm.
much meat it is, and sit in it before searing it off. So that's how I did it for 6 hours, and then took it out and literally just seared it off 5 minutes each side in a cast iron skillet. And then I chopped it up 3 different ways because I cooked it medium rare, medium, and medium well, just in case someone wanted a different
Oh
kind of cook.
wow.
And then you serve it on a board. So did that. That was also a group of more vegetarian friends. So I had to be
Okay.
the purveyor of those in the group, the smaller portion that wanted meat. So let's start
Hmm.
there. Even though I do
Hmm.
love a good vegetarian or chickpeas, cauliflower, I'll definitely eat
Hmm.
all that.
Hmm.
But yes, if someone needs help with the meat, certainly would. And then for the But turkey was another, as you know, turkey is a whole nother process. Everyone has their own
Mhm,
way.
mhm,
For me,
mhm,
the
mhm.
turkey, the first time I used it, it was brown sugar, apple cider, apple cider vinegar, oranges, and a lot more. Oh, maple syrup and something else. A lot more like spices, and then you get it out, and then once it's out the brine and it's cleaned off, you then stuff the skin, like you peel up the skin and stuff it with butter and garlic, and then I also rub crushed garlic all over it. You stuff the cavity with not only the dressing and from the giblets, but also like rosemary. I also sprinkle sage and rosemary on top to get the fresh herb pop. And then I think it was, gosh, I can't remember the temperature, but I want to say like 350 for 4.5 hours, where you
Mhm.
take it off in between, you baste it once more with just melted butter and garlic, and then put it back in. And you just stick a thermometer in it. I believe the temperature is 165 you're supposed to reach, and you just go
Right.
from there. So everyone has a favorite way to do it. That was the easiest one. Plus, that group was not vegetarian group. That group of friends was friends from Germany who moved here a couple years ago, and I happened to meet them, and they had never had an American turkey. That's what they kept saying, is that they just wanted an
Oh,
American
wow.
turkey. It's like, okay, then
Wow.
we got to do the big 20-pounder. We have to have too much leftovers for you to get sick of 48 hours from now. We have to do it properly. So we did.
Wow. That's a great responsibility that you took on, representing the classic American
It's
turkey.
my I would say in the last, it's probably has always been there, but in the last year, maybe it's because I am getting older. Maybe
Uh,
it's, the starting the journey of therapy a year and a half ago. I don't know, but
uh-huh.
really I would say the last year it's really coming to mind that my favorite activity is cooking and drinking with friends. Like not one or the
Mhm.
other, but like both of them. Because when you're cooking with
Yeah,
friends, it's
yeah.
not only like everything being passed around as you're taste testing and you're talking in the kitchen, but usually, like Europeans, you're also eating something else while you're cooking, getting ready to eat. And
Yep.
what's better than eating while you're waiting to eat? That's the
Yeah.
best. But also then
Right.
like just the cocktails and the wine are flowing. So it's just everyone getting involved in the process, no matter what room you're in. There are the people that don't help out in the kitchen either. And so they're just having a good time having their own conversation while waiting for the food. But I do like being an engineer in the kitchen. I love just the tasting to or seasoning to taste, plus like someone else working on cocktails, then someone taking over. Just like the communication and flow of a kitchen. I think I love it.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, well, it's community. I mean, it's a
Community,
group.
yeah.
Yeah, it's a group activity. It's a certain kind of group consciousness that is it's only opened up through, like you said, sharing food and drink in this space and cooperatively doing this task together. And yeah, that's great. I mean, that's just I we do we always we don't smoke the turkey, but we get a smoked turkey. But my favorite part is the turkey gumbo. I think I might have mentioned this. I mentioned this on the show many times before. I'm just done with round one of turkey gumbo, but there's some in the freezer for later. But to your point about cooking and eating at the same time, in New Orleans, the saying is, "Let's have lunch and talk about dinner." So and
Yeah. I love
In New
saying
Orleans, there's a great sense of remorse if you waste a meal, if you have a mediocre meal, you just feel terrible. I mean, it haunts you for the rest of the day. So you said it's your just was your birthday.
that. Mhm.
I know you said don't say you're not fishing for happy belated birthday, but happy belated birthday. So you're a
For sure.
Sagittarius. Do you even care that your sun sign is Sagittarius?
No, but it is true. It's all the cliche stuff you read
No.
about me beating to my own drum, and really like the one thing Sagittarius have going against them is literally just not running away from the problem, but getting bored and going to the next thing. That's
Uh-huh.
certainly like that's the ultimate fight against time, is being content and not wanting to try something different, whether it be in just in life in general with everything, honestly. Yeah, that's
Mhm.
certainly a thing.
Yeah, I'm a Cancer, and Cancer's like the crab. You're a centaur. You're an archer. Uh,
The archer,
when
yeah,
crab
you're just the arrow, basically, yeah.
Right, right, exactly. Who's pulling the bow? Crabs, when their feet are moving forward, they're moving backward. When their feet are moving backward, they're moving forward. They don't ever take a straight line to anything, you know?
That does
Crabs.
actually sound like you, that's why I laugh.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I mean, you can find meaning in anything,
Yeah.
I like the Carl Jung. When I was in law school and I knew I wasn't going to be an attorney, I dabbled in doing astrology and doing birth charts and things like that for a while because hey, people will pay you pretty good money to just sit and talk about them. Everybody loves to hear you talk about them. Everybody loves to hear someone sit and talk about them. And I think the Carl Jung quote was something like wine, where all the vintage of a particular time and place, or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But it's all just meaning if you bring the meaning to it. So birthdays, I guess. Uh, I mean, if I say birthdays when you were a kid, what's one of the first things that pops into your head?
I had a couple parties at the house, but
Uh-huh.
honestly, I've never been someone to want attention, which is odd considering
Uh-huh.
you like
Uh-huh.
Google our name and like
I
our
know.
faces are
Internet
there.
personality.
But yeah, but like that's not why I do this, or nor do I want it for that. Which is also why promotion is such a hard problem for me because like it's just a mental hump I have to get over. Like I have to
Mhm.
promote myself, even though I don't want anyone to know about me. Yeah, it's crazy, but that's what it is for me. Honestly, I avoided birthdays, and even this last night, I wasn't going to
Mhm.
tell anyone, but then like one friend found out, and then she
Yeah.
organized this big 10-person thing where we all had margaritas and just sat around talking, and it was lovely. It was amazing.
Yeah. Well, because you want to give, I mean, this is hard for me too. I have a lot of trouble with it too. Because you have to allow people the chance to do nice things for you, right?
Yeah.
Um, and
And people
and
that's the thing, like, people definitely want to, your friends want to, so it's just getting over that mental hump because I don't want anyone to go out of their way for me, but they don't
exactly.
consider it going out of their way because, we are blessed to being in one another's lives.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, every day I'll try to do something nice for someone
Mm,
because they mean something to me. But yes, these are see now we really are turning this into a therapy session because I know this is like an off ramp where I need to sit down in therapy and talk about some things about like you said sometimes not wanting to be the center of attention. Yet here I am saying, pay attention to me, listen to me, tell me what I have to say is
mhm.
relevant or interesting. Isn't that funny how that works out? But I guess the last thing you were starting to mention, we didn't talk as much about Chicago, but you and I are going to meet up at the Chris Kindle Market down in Chicago in just a matter of like a couple of weeks because time moves faster and faster as closer you get to New Year. And you were saying that you found some stuff that going on down there in Daily Plaza, and this is going to be exciting for me because the Blues Brothers was my favorite movie as a kid. Going to Daily Plaza is like a pilgrimage. Um, so tell me something like when we meet up, you're gonna be like, okay, we got to head over here and check this out.
Do you like wine?
Oh, sure.
I
Wine
told you
and
about it
I.
behind the scenes, but yes,
Yeah.
it's not only the Chris Kindle Market, but the Chris Kindle Market is hosting for the first time, I believe, ever, German wine tasting, German and Austrian wine tasting. So that gets
Uh-huh.
me excited. But downtown, honestly, I don't want to say unfortunately because you need to see it, but it
Yeah.
is a lot of the tourism you need to knock
Sure.
out.
Sure.
The Bean, the Mag Mile, as you said, Daily Plaza, the boat tour is actually amazing. It's very
Oh yeah.
touristy, but to check out all the architecture and have it explained to you, like why it was built as such and who built
Hmm.
it,
Hmm.
it's actually incredible. Plus, there's a bar on the boat, so who can say
Yeah.
no to that?
Oh
Uh,
yeah.
but yeah, other than that, though, I mean, the beautiful thing about Chicago is, and you said you were watching documentaries. Again, we were
Yeah.
talking about behind the scenes. I think Anthony Bourdain like summed it up the best, and that was why his Chicago was his favorite spot. Is just because there's something for everyone here. No matter what area you go to Southport, Bronzeville, you want to go in the middle around the West Loop or River North, you want to go take it higher and go Logan Square, Lincoln Park,
Hmm.
Avondale, go a little higher to Evanston. There's just something genuinely for everyone. That's why I love it. I love the burbs. I love the neighborhoods that are closer to the city. I love south of the city. Hyde
Yeah.
Park is amazing, and rarely do people make it out there if you live north of the city. So it's just all good. There's just too
Yeah.
much, honestly.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you're right too. Getting out into the neighborhoods, there's all the stuff that people know, but you get out into the neighborhoods, you get out into the communities. And yeah, just the history of Chicago, real briefly. I mean, there's a really good, I can't remember the name of the network. It's called Chicago Stories. And they're in the middle of the season right now. It's on YouTube. And they're about an hour long documentaries about things like, the stockyards or the Great Fire or famous people from Jane Byrne, famous people
Mhm.
from Chicago politics, and how the race to reverse the river and some of the different things Chicago had to do just to get out of the initial development period, and going all the way back to the beginning, like why is Chicago even where it is? What problems that present? What are the good things about that? How did they overcome that? It's very similar to the stories of New Orleans, and the more everything is so fascinating. You peel it back, the real stories of everything are the most fascinating stories. That's why we love to tell them and examine them with you,
Yep.
with wonderful people like John Daigle. And thank you still. We're energy. What I do about my energy level, I get it from these wonderful people.